Welcome back to the CSP Elite Baseball Development Podcast. I'm your host, Eric Cressey, and this is episode 125. Today's guest is one that I'm actually really excited about. I've known him for quite some time. He's doing some really cool stuff in the industry around communication, establishing rapport, optimizing buy-in from your athletes. Just a lot of these soft skills, for lack of a better term, that I think are incredibly important for coaches from all walks of life to really get through to their athletes and optimize results. I think this is one of the conversations I've enjoyed the most. I learned a lot from talking to him, and I've certainly learned a lot from his resources over the years. So I think we're in for a good one. Hope you enjoy it. This episode is brought to you by Athletic Greens, the most comprehensive NSF certified for sport daily nutritional supplement I've ever tried. With so many stressors in life, it's difficult to maintain effective nutritional habits and give our bodies the nutrients they need to thrive. As a father of 3 young kids and a co-founder of multiple businesses in multiple states, on top of still being an avid exerciser, I know that busy schedules can really take their toll on us. Whether it's poor sleep, exercise or life stressors, environmental factors, or simply not eating enough of the right foods, we can wind up deficient nutritionally. This is where Athletic Greens can really help. It's a game-changing nutritional insurance policy. They simplify the logistics of getting optimal nutrition on a daily basis by giving you just one thing with all the best things. And that's why I use it daily and recommend it to our athletes. One scoop of Athletic Greens contains 75 vitamins, minerals, and whole food sourced ingredients, including a multivitamin, multimineral, probiotic, green superfood blend, and more. They work together to fill the nutritional gaps in your diet, increase energy and focus, aid in digestion, recovery, and supporting of a healthy immune system. This all can happen without taking multiple products. While most nutritional products come to market and stay stagnant, Athletic Greens continues to obsessively improve this one holistic formula based on the latest research, producing 53 improvements over the last decade. They invest in the most absorbable and natural source of each ingredient and go above and beyond in third-party testing to ensure their customers continue to receive the highest quality and best daily nutritional habit on the planet. It's lifestyle friendly, whether you're keto, paleo, vegan, dairy-free, or gluten-free, and contains less than 1 gram of sugar without compromising on taste. They put 75 ingredients through the NSF for Sport certification to come up with a formula that's trusted by some of the world's best athletes, including our own. Right now, Athletic Greens is giving our listeners 10 free travel packets with their subscription. Simply go to athleticgreens.com/Cressey to receive my offer. These travel packs are perfect for supporting your immune system, energy, and gut health when you're traveling for games, training, or simply when you're on the go. They can be a great counterbalance to less than ideal on-the-road food options. So if you want to bridge the gap between deficient and optimal and give yourself the best chance to get nutrient diversity, then head to athleticgreens.com/Cressey and get your 10 free travel packets today. Again, that's athleticgreens.com/Cressey, Cressey. Today's guest is a keynote speaker, performance coach and consultant, a best-selling author, and the founder of Art of Coaching. His experience includes working with members of Fortune 500 companies, the U.S. Special Forces, sports organizations, and professional athletes. He's also the author of Conscious Coaching, The Art and Science of Building Buy-in. As a coach, he's worked with a diverse range of athletes across 23 sports worldwide at levels ranging from youth athletes to Olympians. He's supported numerous Super Bowl and World Series champions, along with several professional fighters. He's currently conducting his doctoral research focused on the role of power dynamics, persuasion, and optimizing change management within organizations at the University of Limerick. Please welcome to the show, Brett Bartholomew. Brett, my man, this is long overdue. Thank you for joining us.
Eric, yeah, my pleasure. It's always nice talking to you.
So I'm a listener of your podcast. So I have big shoes to fill, kind of flipping the script and having you on this one. So I put a lot of thought into what we're going to cover. So I'm excited to have you.
Likewise.
So man, I think I look back on the years. I want to say it was like 2013, maybe 2014, where I was out at spring training, meeting up with some of our guys in Arizona, came by to work out at Exos. And it was the first time I met you. And I think back to it, it was like a quiet day. I mean, you guys were kind of clearly in the same, like, hey, baseball guys actually have to go and play baseball. So it was like a mellow day in March, kind of late afternoon. You and Eric Dannenberg were holding down the fort. And I just distinctly remember thinking in that moment that you were a dude that kind of kept a weight room energetic even when the athletes didn't provide it, right? It was like late afternoon. It was kind of a quiet period, which we know, like, when you have 30 athletes in the gym, it creates the energy. And I really think back in that moment to like, it was firm handshake, look people in the eye, introduce yourself. But just that energy that you brought, I think I was there just lifting with my business partner, Pete, kind of saying hello to Eric because he and I go way back. He's the Massachusetts guy. But I just distinctly remember that about you. Do you think in a lot of ways, like you're obviously doing some different stuff beyond just strength and conditioning now. Do you think that you had the persona that led to like this direction into leadership and personal development, all that stuff? Or was it very acquired from that time?
Yeah, I think it was well, first of all, really astute memory. You're right. Like, it was 2012, 2013. And most of our pro groups were like 8, 10, and 1. And so this was later in the afternoon, kind of that afternoon lull, time for you to get your bearings before the second wave came in. And just for what it's worth, before I answer that directly, I mean, similar to you, there were a lot of people that first things first, I grew up as a fan of strength and conditioning and performance, right? But I think you've been in it long enough. It's also a career that is within that vocation. There's a lot of people that want to create separation. There's a lot of people that want to create debate and whatever. And you were so different and are so different in the sense that when I had a chance to meet some of my metaphorical heroes, they didn't always turn out how you thought they would be. A lot of times they'd kind of look at you like you're some young upstart, you coming from my market share. And man, were you the opposite, just welcoming, huge grin, always looked at like, hey, pull up, seat at the table kind of thing. And just a very refreshing difference from some of that old guard. So I want to thank you for that, just for whatever that was.
That was a fun day.
In regards to the persona, I think it's probably a mix, right? Like, of course, like anybody, it takes a while to come into your own and really find where, even if you have your voice, which I think my voice has been pretty consistent over the years, it's at least finding the best place to direct it. I think that it's one, looking back at things I did then and being really critical. I have just the right amount of self-hate to know all my imperfections, and being somebody that either recorded my sessions, of course, with approval of athletes, or videotaped it to kind of assess that, because not at every place I went to, you don't always get that feedback. Now AP did a better job than most. You would do 360 reviews, but you'd kind of hear the same thing. Oh, okay, like you're passionate, but you can kind of come off as aggressive and try this and try that. But it was hard to get really good feedback on what you do, how you do it. And so I think that persona has evolved over time, being very aware of my mistakes, the areas that I think I'm a little bit stronger in, or that I try to get subjective data even from athletes or whatever. And just continually putting yourself out there more too, as you know, with your podcast and everything you do, you just start to see yourself through a different lens. And at first, well, it's always cringy, right? I don't know if you feel that way. Like, it's always cringy, but at least at the end of the day, you're like, wow, okay, I can have a very real assessment of some things that I think I do decently well, some things I definitely need to do better. And so, I think it's changed over time, but I'd like to think that there's been some consistency, but you're a better judge of that, right? Like you see me through a different lens of posts and having met me, and you're not around me every day. Do you think I've been relatively consistent?
I think so. And I think that staying power is something that's very overlooked in our industry. I mean, I'm sure you've seen it. I mean, we've had intern classes 3 semesters a year, basically dating all the way back till 2007. And I can't tell you how many times we've seen like that one that walks in like the first month, you're like, this is a definite must hire. This kid's a rock star. And it's always the energy guy. It's like whoever's the loudest and whoever is like, and by like the end of 8 to 12 weeks, like sometimes they're literally exhausted. They got like plantar fasciitis, their voice is raw, like they're actually underwhelming. And you realize that sometimes like this perception of crazy energy, it always wears off, right? There has to be some kind of substance, because if the athletes don't see the substance, they tune you out, right? Everyone's had the rah yell in their face high school football coach that they look back on and they're like, man, that guy was just an a-hole.
Yeah. Well, and I think from that, now that you phrase it that way, I have a better take, like the energy behind it. And this was something I had to explain to a colleague at one point in time, that we didn't really get along. They were more on the PT side of things. And so I remember one day they said to me, why do you have to be so loud? And now granted, this was after coaching a group of like 34 guys, and you remember how AP set up on one side of the room. And so there's somebody else on the other side of the room. And I just remember that there had been enough friction here that I could read between the lines. And it was just kind of time to address this, because on the other end, I felt like they were always passive aggressive and kind of snarky to me. And that's not how the workplace needed to be. So, I kind of sat them down one time and I was just like, listen, my background was such that I nearly lost my life due to poor communication in part, part decision making on my end that led to some poor health behaviors. But when I was a part of this medical system for a year of my life, they kind of treated you like you were a symptom, not really a human being. But when you have a year of your life taken away from you in a hospital, and also you grow up in a family where a lot of people close to you died relatively young, you kind of just start living different, and so I lived almost like a 99-year-old from the age of 16 on, just because I realized how quickly that could be gone. And I think one of the most indelible memories there was my mother. One time she had gotten in a fight with my grandmother, and the night after that fight, my grandmother had died of a massive heart attack. Well, I'm 12, and I just remember my mom bawling her eyes out saying, don't ever let a day that goes by without letting people like that you care about them, because you don't know when that's going to, and that's an intense thing to tell a 12-year-old, but my mom was overcome with emotions, and I get it. And I think I've just always been more of a serious, hey, you're not kind of promised tomorrow. Now, at the same time, I'm not a military, for anybody that doesn't know me, I'm not one of the militaristic, rah, that's not my thing. My tone of voice is how it is naturally. And I'm kind of powered by urgency, and that's just kind of how I am. So hopefully that gives you a better answer.
I like that. And maybe it leads into the first question. You kind of maybe partially answered is like, what started you on this, I'm not sure if path is the right way, maybe this discipline underneath this overarching coaching umbrella. So many people are stuck on X's and O's of the industry, right? They're the people who are reading super training for the 34th time. Was it who, what, when, where, why, how did you come to realize that relationships were at the center of all of our success at coaches, because it seems like common sense, but we know that's far from the case in the world we work in.
No question. And this is something where, again, I could go on for a while. So I'll try to be brief, and then let me know where you want me to go deeper. So one piece of that is I want to put a disclaimer out there. I don't know if the route that I went is the smartest thing for most people in the performance industry, because, it's a lot. You can make a lot more money a lot more quickly if you stay on the X's and O's. And I mean, if you look at that, if we're just objective about it, our industry has really commoditized things like that. If you sell equipment, if you sell unique methods, I mean, there are certifications out there where people are charging obscene amounts of money, and you're like on cupping level 12, and this has nothing to do with any of these organizations, right? So I'm going to use this one colloquially, but like FMS level 10, and then somebody creates a competitor to that. And then, so it's commoditized very much around equipment and X's and O's. And so I knew when I started Art of Coaching in general, like, all right, we could go the route of just appealing to strength coaches. I could say, hey, I've trained athletes for 15 years of my life, and we're going to teach you how to set up drills and do this. But like for us, what the Art of Coaching was really about was social agility and the way you adapt your communication style and tailor it. No different than it's periodization for people. I'll just put that headline out there, right? Like we understand that you've got to lift weights at different loads and different intensities and at different vectors and in different planes of motion, different times a year. But we live in a society that really it tailors its coffee selections more than it does its communication choices. And so what really got me on this path was, again, at 14, I was very much in a tough part of my life. Friends were getting into drugs. Parents were going through a divorce. I had a lot of anxiety and anger. I've always been a pretty anxious person. I always kind of think steps ahead. I'm kind of ready. I'm ready for whatever. And I got that from my parents. Both grew up poor. They had to make a lot out of their life, kind of turn something into nothing. And we grew up with that. Now we didn't grow up poor. I want to make that distinction, right? But we got that kind of drive from our parents. And so I remember when my parents were going through this and my friends were, we're talking about people getting into like cocaine and heroin. And if you know me, that's not really my bag. Yeah. And so what I would do to channel a lot of this anger and anxiety and just really OCD at the time is I'd work out constantly. Mm-hmm. But at 14 and 15, you're reading Men's Health, Muscle and Fitness. I'm not, I didn't really have a performance coach to guide me. And so I did what any good extremist did. I did everything. And I followed low carb, low fat. So I'm eating Kraft, fat-free Kraft singles and egg beaters and turkey bacon and doing 10 sprints up our stairs every morning to kickstart your metabolism. And, eventually I got to a point where I just pushed myself so far. My heart, kidney, and liver were all near failure. I was basically just cannibalizing my own lean muscle tissue because I wasn't eating enough to sustain my own activity. So I went from 130 pounds my sophomore year of high school down to as low as 97 pounds. And so that eventually put me in an inpatient eating disorder hospital. very extreme. You woke up at 5:30 in the morning. Every day your heart or your blood was taken and you were weighed in a gown. They use the BMI of all things to assess, your health status of whether you could exercise or not. For the first 2 weeks, I couldn't shower because they thought the initial shock of hot or cold would send me into cardiac arrest. And, it's just 8 hours of sitting around in a day room where you're observed with other patients and everything's monitored. Well, one thing I noticed when I was there is, you would have to meet with a therapist and you do group therapy as well. And you're in there with a wide variety of people, from a junior Olympic wrestler who was beaten when he didn't make weight. His dad had beat him, to a woman who was 64 and her husband cheated on her. And so she developed an eating disorder. But the bottom line is all of them had an underlying issue that caused their behavior. And we know that from any form of addiction or most issues. And it was fascinating because what they would tell the doctors is not what they would talk about when the doctors left, right? You saw a real-time Hawthorne effect. Yeah. And so I remember it was like a master's degree in psychology and abnormal behavior just being in this place. So anyway, I'll fast forward. Eventually, to get myself out of this situation, I had to gain a lot of weight. I had to gain a lot of weight fast. So I started learning everything I could about physical performance, actual training, nutrition, all this stuff, and also psychology. And eventually gained the weight, got out of the hospital, went and got a degree in exercise science, got a master's degree in motor learning. And it was really at that time when everything coalesced, because my degree focused on cueing and attentional focus, basically the impact of what we say. Mm-hmm. And so looking into research of, wow, I could use this cue or that cue and we could elicit better effects. What else in the world influences our behavior? Well, obviously things like color and scent. I mean, there's research out there that talks about ambient odor that casinos use, how that impacts slot machine usage. And so going down this rabbit hole, it just led me down, all things human behavior. And I said, wow, this makes a lot of sense. Because at that point in time now, I was in strength and conditioning formally. And I really liked athletes that were quote unquote problem athletes. So people would send guys to me that, I can't really figure this guy out, or this guy's a pain in the ass, whatever. And guy being an inclusive term, male or female. And I knew, just because that's how I was labeled in the hospital, that there's a lot more to people than we think. Mm-hmm. And so anyway, yeah, I think that was really the cross section of later in my career realizing, wow, I might have gotten into it because I love the human body and training and performance, but really it's the psychology and the wonderful mess of people that really keeps me in it. And then I wanted to go down that rabbit hole further, which is what we're doing today.
That's phenomenal. And I know we've spoken about it, not a story completely dissimilar to mine, both in terms of like timelines and experiences and, to some degree outcomes. I love this concept of like the periodization of people, and when you literally said that, obviously we're on a baseball podcast, you've probably seen this, like there's a remarkable dynamic in the baseball world. So we'll say a minor league baseball season ends, second week in September, right? Guys get back and they're sick of, being on 9-hour bus rides, living in crappy hotels, not being able to have the autonomy they want. A lot of them are like banged up from throwing a bunch of innings. They're just ready to like start the off season. And not only that, you go to the off season, you have your off season buddies that are different than your organizational buddies. So yeah, they're all like psyched to be back. It's like huge hugs, all this, they're getting strong. They're getting their body weight back where it needs to be. And then right around like Thanksgiving, everybody's like, if they've shut down, they're just like antsy to start actually playing baseball again. They want to start throwing, they build up, and then they're happy, they're satisfied that around the start of January, it's all like, oh, we're sick of just throwing. We need to be off the mound, throw bullpens. So they're a little bit happy about that. They get to, February, all of a sudden they want to throw live BPs. Hey, I need a hitter in the box. They're sick of the offseason training dynamic just because it's been going. They're ready to start playing. Spring training starts up, right? They're thrilled to see all their buddies again, and games start up. Everything's great. And then everybody's like, oh, spring training's too long. They hate it. Right. By the last week in March, just start the games that matter. And then the season gets going and it's like dog days of summer. You know what I mean? Like I actually talked to Nick Swisher the other day. He said that, they played well over 200 games the year that they won the World Series in 2009. It just starts like crazy. So if you're on a bad team and you're 20 games under 500 by the time July rolls around, it's like, gosh, when will this season end? It's 1,000,000 degrees in Kansas City. And so they go through these like fluctuations of loving and hating baseball. And even under the loving and hating baseball umbrella, they like certain components of it. And it is, you're entirely right. It's like literally managing a different personality 7 to 8 different times over the course of a year. Starting pitchers that have a bad outing and they're miserable for 4 days while they got to think about it. I just love that line. I'm completely going to steal that. I can't believe I've never heard you mention it before.
Yeah. Well, if anything, it makes you realize the, what's the phrase I would use? Sometimes I feel like my work is pretty meaningless from the standpoint of, I gave a presentation called Periodization for People for years. And then you think, man, people have got to be tired of hearing about this, and we have like an online course called Buyin that was like a sequel to conscious coaching. And then it's funny because it reminds you, no matter how many times you've talked about something, right? Like the world's a huge place. There's 8 billion people and they're all super busy. And so it's refreshing to hear you say, no, I love that term because, I kind of got away from just talking about it for a while because I'm like, when you share your own work, you kind of just have the assumption. It was almost like when you coach groups, right? You'll have 6 groups a day. You're teaching them all RDLs or cleans or this and that. And it can start to influence your programming. It can be like, oh my God, I feel like they're going to be so bored. Well, first of all, you can't worry about that. Like it's fundamentals, not fluff when it comes to programming. But like you got to keep some level of engagement. But 2, I have to check myself and be like, is everybody tired of that? Or have they only seen it 3 times? Whereas I've talked about it or taught it like 48 times. So, but that is what it is, right? Because periodization is just, all it is planning. All it is planning, and that feeds into program design, and it's got to adapt. And you mentioned it wonderfully, and that goes into this myth that our audience, and hopefully it can help some of yours as well. Somebody asked the other day, well, as a coach, how do you make sure you maintain an authentic self? And you mentioned, all right, well, one person can have many different expressions of their personality over time, right? Depending on what they're going through and everything. And I said, well, that's the same thing with authentic self. I hate this phrase, like be your authentic self. Well, which version? Because my authentic self, when I'm outside, when my son comes home from daycare and he's riding his little toy tractor around, is a different authentic self than when I'm on here expressing professional and personal views. A different authentic self than when I'm with my wife, when we're about to go on our first vacation in like 4 years. They're all in the range of who Brett Bartholomew is at different points in time with different people in his life. And that was like the same thing about the archetypes in conscious coaching is some people thought like, oh, well, you can't put people in buckets like that. I'm like, time out. Nobody has ever said any of these things are static. People are going to present. It's all about what we call contextual propriety. Like how do you act in accordance with the circumstances and setting where you're at right now? And so these coaches that think they have to be one way all the time for everybody, that's just not right. Your values can guide you. Sure, your values and your ethics shouldn't change, but your persona absolutely should adapt to the environment of the moment within boundaries, of course. So you don't need to cater, but you should be, you should, that's what communication is, a shared process of meaning making, and you got to get on the same page.
You talked about the idea of, hey, I've spoken about this for a long time, but I'm still like amazed that, people haven't heard it or people haven't adopted it or whatever. What's so interesting, we go to a Perform Better seminar or whatever it is. We pick up a few new exercises during the hands-on. That's very easy to implement. You say, hey, I just saw that. That's going to be great for Joe Smith, who's got a hip internal rotation deficit, when I see him at the gym on Thursday, whatever, right? So you can easily integrate it. I think it's very hard to have a lot of these psychological principles top of mind in those moments. Like a lot of them are easily applied across a number of different people if you take time to take a step back and think about it. But we just aren't wired to do that. It's harder to, what they say, the hardest day of the seminar is always Monday, right? It's going back and actually putting it into action. So go ahead.
I was just saying, that's an astute, there's a reason for that, right? So if you look at, there's this 2016 meta-analysis by, I'll mispronounce the name, Lefevre and Evans. And they said out of 285 coach development programs, and this was even looking at sport coaching, fewer than 6% focus on anything interpersonal. And so you're right. You go to these seminars and you wonder all right, well, certain people can apply this, they can't apply that. But if you look at the nature of education in the field in general, that's a pretty alarming state of coach education. When you look at the definition of coaching, coaching is a social practice done between social beings in a social environment. And so we knew that all right, cool, but if you want to make people use this, what do you do? Well, the way you educate people on this stuff, we figured out has to be very much tied to experiential learning. So yes, you can have the presentations, but in our seminars, we also use improv, role playing, case study breakouts, group reviews. We'll videotape people. So coaches will come to our clinics. We'll put them in social scenarios and it's real life, right? So it could be like, hey, you're dealing with an athlete that, kind of gives you this pushback, or it could be a sport coach and they're all very open. So it's not even just strength coaches. We had 2 members of the highway patrol come to our last one. We've had firefighters. We've had an FBI agent. So people bring these scenarios and we'll act them out. We film them and then we actually use kind of a categorical breakdown to evaluate, and they evaluate themselves so they can account for egocentric bias, which we all have, peer bias, and then we do group bias, and then very much just like Sports Center, right? We'll commentate on this and that. We'll break down, look at what you did with your nonverbal here and there. And the point of that is for the reason you mentioned. People can't apply something if they can't remember it. And the best way to get them to remember it is to encode it with an actual emotional response or experience. And I don't care how practiced you are when you're role playing, even though, our seminars are not like a gotcha, we're trying to make you look stupid. They're very inclusive. But when you're role playing, your heart's it's gonna bump a little bit, and so that's part of the reason, Eric, is like this stuff that you've seen it. You go to these clinics and it's just 300 people staring up at a screen. Mm-hmm. And then they're bombarded with another presenter and another presenter and another presenter. How could you ever put that into use? Mm-hmm. Because there's nothing really there solidifying the encoding of the information. I'm not saying it's like worthless. I'm just saying that, and then when you do a practical at these, usually the people that like to train and exercise are going to be the ones that do it. But it's funny, like, why have there been no coaching things, and then we just talk about cueing. Well, this is a lot deeper than cueing. Yeah. But anyway, I just thought that was a really good point you brought up.
I think it's phenomenal. And, I even think just from, I think being in the private sector, I'm acutely aware of a lot of these things where maybe we have more continuity with athletes, and I see them every day. I think professional baseball is a really challenging dynamic in that regard, because you think about just the lack of continuity for players, right? Because the goal is to always advance levels, right? You go to the FCL, then you go to low A, then you go to high, you go to double A, you go to triple A, you go to the big leagues. And there's always constant fluctuations in staff. And we're not just talking about like your hitting coach. There's pitching coach, bench coach, there's the clubhouse attendants, there's your athletic trainers, your strength coaches, there's analysts, there's video guys, there's literally everything imaginable going on. Like, it kind of speaks to, don't just have these skills, like you've got to refine these skills so that you can efficiently identify the best way to get through to people. It's not just good enough to like, hey, I figured them out after 9 months after they already hated me. You have to get through to them relatively quickly.
Yeah. Well, and when we asked, like, as part of my doctorate, we asked 25 different coaches. And I remember 3 of them were performance directors in baseball. And then we tried to get an international sampling. So we had rugby, we had, everything from strength coaches to performance directors. And we had asked them, what role do you believe communication plays in your day to day? They'd give an answer, and then I'd say, okay, how important is about communication with respect to what you do? And then I said, as a communicator, how would you rank yourself 1 to 10, with 10 being excellent, 1 being blah, and obviously this is more formal in the semi-structured interview. And the majority of them, you'd always get answers between 5 and 8. They'd say, well, I'm pretty good, but I could always get better, that kind of thing. But then when I said, well, what instrument did you utilize to measure that? And it was always a long pause. It was like, yeah, nothing. Yeah. And I said, well, what mechanism, like what was the device, so to speak, in any form? And they're like, just do people. One guy goes, did people do what I tell them to do? And then he goes, my God, that sounded awful. Yeah. And then somebody else said, I just kind of asked my athletes, where I kind of read the room. And then that brings in the conversation about bias. You realize that, again, most coaches will get evaluated on the technical parts of what they do. They don't get evaluated on and it's funny, because if you do evaluate on a technical part, whether you're a sport coach, right, in the baseball realm, or your performance in baseball, or any of that, if somebody shows you a different exercise or technique or drill, you might be like, cool, another tool for the toolbox, no problem. But all of a sudden, if somebody checks you on the way that you interacted, even if it's in a positive way, that's almost like an affront to me personally. Mm-hmm. It seems like that, or do I respect that person? Yeah. And that was something else that the research said, is most coaches only learn to coach either based on the way they were coached, or they model themselves off of what they believe to be a success. And you can't do that. Like, when we get members of other communities in that are non-sport, non-performance, like the military, especially, and firefighters, they love that feedback. Mm-hmm. And I asked them that one time, I go, why do you think you guys, like, you don't have any problem with that? Like, move, shoot, communicate, just rooted in you. And he said, it's simple. Like, this is life or death for us. Yeah. And then that was a really big kind of stoke to a gentleman that was in the performance realm at one of our workshops that was apprehensive about role playing, almost kind of thought it was silly. Mm-hmm. When you see an FBI agent and a firefighter get up there and do it, mm-hmm. now you're going to tell me that's silly? Like, these guys have no problem. So we need more of that cross learning, so to speak, I think, too.
It's almost like there's a hesitancy to accept it, because there's like an inherently subjective nature to it, right? Like, if you and I are working in a professional dynamic, and I'm like, hey, that guy blew his hamstrings out. Like, it's very black and white, right? That's a grade 3 hamstrings injury. We're staring at the MRI. Clearly something in his program wasn't good. you can wear that and be like, you know what, you're right. Like I need to do a better job with the way I coach that exercise or how I wrote that program, whatever. If I come at you and I say, well, I don't think you handled that situation well, like there's inherently like a subjective nature to it. So I totally get why people fight it. That doesn't mean that it's wrong though.
No, well, and you look at that, most things in life are subjective, right? Even the interpretation of data. And so let's say there was a purely objective lie detector test, right? There's no room for error or whatever. And you took 30 of them and you were wrongly committed for murder. You're in jail, but now all this data shows, no, you are telling the truth. Well, it doesn't matter because a jury of your peers still committed you to murder. And it doesn't matter even if I had the most objective way and said, hey, here, this is you're a great communicator. Well, that doesn't play in terms of every country at every age and whatever. And so just like there's a farm to table restaurant down the road, the guy he's from Sicily, makes probably some of the best pizza I've ever had. There's definitely people in Atlanta that think it's trash and love Little Caesars. So subjectivity reigns supreme because perception is a completely individual experience. I mean, even with the injury, and I got your point, but I'd argue that, I mean, injuries are complex. It could be our programming. It could be something else the coach did. It could be, could be, and it's always a number of factors, but that's a piece of, even though people like you, what you want to take is that subjective, like there's no perfect score in how we evaluate it. What there is what we're trying to address is the perceptual gap. So let's say we were evaluating you on your use of assertiveness in the context of a particular role-playing scene. And you had a gentleman from Spain and he gave you a 2, and which is kind of moderately assertive. We had somebody else that gave you a 1. 2 other people gave you a 3, and you gave yourself a 2. Well, you would kind of talk about why you gave yourself this score. They would share their. Well, what we look at is once we get enough data points, if we see that you're constantly giving yourself a 3 and almost everybody else is that, 0 to 1 range, or vice versa, you're always giving yourself a 1, but everybody else is a 3. Well, then that creates an opportunity to have a conversation about it. Or for you to just say, hey, you gave me a 1 on that. Come up here and show me what you mean. How would you approach it? Now that's no different than athletes, right? Whether it's a baseball player or a sport coach, just sharing ideas and tactics. And that's what happens all the time. You always get somebody that says, oh, here's a faster way to do this, or here's something I picked up when I was at this job. So it's just a matter about skill, like improving your skills and taking suggestions. Here's how you ask. Here's another way you could ask that question. And lawyers are notorious for doing this. I'm nerding out right now on the Johnny Depp Amber Heard trial. That's it's a long story. Don't get me into it. But like the lawyer said something, he asked a question and he was like, do you drink often? And they go objection, and they gave the objection. So we had to reframe it. He goes, how often would you say you do have a drink? And they're like objections. And he goes, do you, are there opportunities where, and the guy was like trying to think of another way on the air to ask that question. He ended up having to ask the question 7 different ways just before I got it. And I was like, that's wonderful. The first time I ever met Manny Ramirez, I remember I was like 2009 and I'm trying to communicate to him one way. And he's like, what do you mean? And I'm like, all right, we'll try this. And then I'm like, analogies and metaphors. Now I came up to something there, or I had been to the Dominican, so I could link it to something. And so it's just sometimes, man, like getting out of your own head and getting feedback on where you like, just don't tell me, not you, but like, don't tell me that you want to be a better coach or a better leader, but that you don't want to work on communication. Like it's something that leads to wars, failed marriages, and, telehealth. 80% of information is remembered incorrectly on telehealth. Think about that. Think about the ramifications of it. And, right. So anyway, it's just people got to get over themselves. And that's the core of it, especially in coaching.
So, and maybe we've even like paved the way to this next question, and just with the kind of the quick touch on the Manny Ramirez interaction. But, let's explore this concept of buy-in more, which you've obviously hit really heavily in your work. Why do some coaches get it and others don't? And how do seemingly good coaches ascend to be great coaches, utilizing a lot of the principles that you've emphasized over the years?
Yeah, I think it's a loaded question. I think that there's some understanding buy-in requires a number of things, and this is not exhaustive. One, self-awareness, right? You have to have and this goes into like fundamental attribution error at the silliest level. Think about when you speed down the road. You're usually like, all right, I'm late for an appointment, or I've got, it's always some situational issue. Whereas if somebody else speeds, we make it a personal thing. That person's crazy, And so most coaches just are not very aware There's also that leads into the better than average effect. Most people believe themselves to be more virtuous, more competent than they really are, right? It's kind of like a cousin of the Dunning-Kruger. The most confident people are usually the least competent in many respects, because you should know what you don't know. So self-awareness is huge. And I'll get more tactical as we break down, just giving an overview. Impression management, and understanding that you and everybody else, all of us, we're never the same way all the time. And it wouldn't be functional to be. You don't want to talk to your kids the same way you do your in-laws. You don't want to talk to your in-laws the same way you do your athletes. There's always going to be subtle differences. The fact that you brought up really, really well earlier on, perception, right? Like, where's this gulf between objectivity and subjectivity, knowing that not everybody is going to think the same thing, and then that's theory of mind as well. And then being able to really recognize power dynamics, influence tactics, and cater those to your audience. But I think the biggest thing right there is the self-awareness piece. Because if you look at the difference of like what buy-in really is commitment, right? And if you look on a spectrum and we say, all right, people, there's things we need to get done. There's tasks, right? Let's just look at task related. This is from Gary Uckel at the University of Albany. And then there's relation-oriented commitment, or really, and so that's, do I feel good about the person? Do I feel good about the task I have to carry out? So if we say that buy-in is the same as commitment, what we're looking for is somebody that feels really good about the individual and what they're asking them to do. So it's a plus in the task column and a plus in the relation column. Now, if there's compliance, which is different than commitment, right? There's usually an asymmetry. You either feel good about the person, but not what they're asking you to do, the task, or vice versa. You're not really bought into that person, but the task, you got to do, right? Either to keep your job or, whatever. And so I think most people, aside from not being very self-aware, I think they confuse compliance for commitment. That's why you see kind of the whistleblowing, just militaristic yelling culture that you do, or sometimes just the lazy culture of, most people don't coach. It kind of just give people ultimatums or just kind of slink throughout the day. It can be very lazy. I'll stop there and see if there's anything you want me to elaborate on.
No, you just said the compliance versus commitment. It's like the don't confuse sweat with hard work. You know what I mean? It's a line. Jacoby Brissett, quarterback, actually dropped that one with me once. It was something that Bill Parcells taught him, and it's like right on point. Is that there's a very, very hefty difference. We interrupt this episode with a quick reminder that this podcast is brought to you by Athletic Greens. It's an NSF certified all-in-one superfood supplement with 75 whole food sourced ingredients designed to support your body's nutritional needs. I use this product daily, and a ton of our athletes do as well. Head to athleticgreens.com/Cressey and claim my special offer today for 10 free travel packs with your first purchase. I'd encourage you to give it a shot too, especially because of this great offer and because it gives you peace of mind knowing that you're covering all your nutritional bases. Again, that's athleticgreens.com/Cressey, CRESSEY, to get that special offer. You talked about these concepts, with respect to like perception, and the line I always use, I probably drop this once a week in some capacity, is like perception is reality, right? Maybe the client's an idiot, but they don't understand our system. It's our fault. The reality is that we didn't do a good job explaining it if they can't pick it up, right? If the athlete didn't get where we needed to go, like that's the reality, whether it was our fault, their fault, anything like that, we have to own it and be better. I mean, do you find that in general people are getting better about that, right? We see like these concepts of like extreme ownership that have been put out in the in the lay publications. With like, are people actually improving on the grand scheme of things? Are we more unaware of ourselves than ever before?
Yeah, I think it's a mix. It is what compelled me to do more than just, conscious coaching was a starting point, but nobody ever really gets better just by reading a book, right? Not that I don't want people to support the book, please, But like, then we created, and this is all part of my doctoral output. We were like, all right, because we were assessing the feasibility of communication training within coaching. And so then it was like, all right, well, let's do it in a digital medium, an interactive course shot masterclass style. We invested like $35,000 into it, had it shot in like 4K, whole thing. And we got really good responses from that. It had some evaluations and assessments, but of course, those things are only done in a vacuum since people could do it from a distance. So then the third output was, all right, what we call our apprenticeship, just because it's that old Ernest Hemingway line, right? We're all apprentices in a craft you never master. that's more than true than ever before in communication. But we're like, all right, now we need to do a live, an in-person course and assess this. So to your point, we're like, all right, well, how can we bring about enhanced learning, skill acquisition, and self-awareness, the very things that, as you mentioned, like we need to have if we're going to get more buy-in and understanding. So that's when we really leaned on the use of role playing and even the informal use of improv as our form of overload. Right. So there's conceptual skill. If you just look at improv, which was really popularized by two women, Neva Boyd and Viola Spolin, who during the Great Depression, as part of the New Deal, they had taken, there were so many immigrants coming into America that what they wanted to do is flatten the hierarchy between immigrant children and American children. How can we get them to assimilate more and feel more comfortable? Well, they used adapted theater games because then everybody felt a little silly, but all these games had things that they worked on, right? Like some of the backbone of the games was listening. Some of it was just use of tone, much like with exercises, right? In the weight room, a lot of these things look indirect, but they can have direct improvement in performance, right? If you look at a squat, that doesn't look like a sports skill, right? Like no, even if you look at jumping, no, like a full squat doesn't look like that, but we know that it can carry over into acceleration and power development and different means. So same thing with improv. So then we thought, all right, well, let's take that a little step further. We'll use improv for levity and almost as our corrective if somebody stinks at a certain level of our evaluation, but it's the role playing in the situational planning. So let's say, Eric, you're having a conversation with a sport coach, right? Well, that can go myriad ways, but let's just plot out 4. On one end of the spectrum, let's go the absolute worst way it could go. On the other end, almost so easy, it was like, wow, that was a joke. And then let's look at 2 derivations between that. Well, we can act those all out within 3 to 5 minutes. We can game them out. Just give me some characteristics of that coach, and give me some context of that. Boom, we can act it out. So when we utilize overload and that role playing, yes, I think people that embrace that, they get in there and they actually experience it. They get that adaptation. But it's just like, I can read about training that doesn't grow muscles, right? I can watch somebody play the piano. I don't know how to all of a sudden knock out Beethoven. I think that's the thing coaches have to understand is reading all these leadership books, reading all these other things, listening to podcasts, even though I want them to listen to yours and mine, that is not enough to be a better communicator. Yeah. Waking up as a husband does not make me a better spouse every day. This takes active practice and constant work.
It's 25 years of experience versus the same year of experience 25 times. I literally, while you started talking about I kind of asked the question relating to like just self-awareness, and in your first couple of sentences, you made me think, I pulled up an email I sent. You've heard about this, the great resignation that's taking place in the world, like, right? Everybody was like, man, I love working on Zoom in my pajamas. I don't ever want to go back to work, right? So resignations have been off the charts. And actually, Adam Grant just had a great podcast about this. And it was actually a Wall Street Journal article that came out, and they said that so-called boomerang hires, so this is people that go back to their old jobs, accounted for 4.5% of all new hires among companies on LinkedIn in 2021. Wow. So one out of every 25 hires is someone going back to where they were previously. And this is a quote. It said, in a tight market, some recruiters may be distorting the nature of jobs or overpromising how autonomous hires will be. Nearly 3/4 of workers who quit to take a new job said they felt surprise or regret, according to a survey of 2,500 U.S. adults conducted earlier this year by the Muse, a job search and career coaching company. Nearly half of those workers said they would try to get their old job back. More than 40% said they'd give their current employers 2 to 6 more months before switching again. Employers can no longer count on the people they're hiring today, giving them at least 2 years, said the Muse's founder. Like that is like stunning to me. And it's a perfect like example of like self-awareness. Like, hey, like maybe it's you, and I don't mean that like disparaging to anybody that's thinking about quitting their job, but we see it at all levels, right? We see guys that are entering the transfer portal in college baseball who are convinced it's just that coach that has it in for them, or people in the strength and conditioning field that are convinced that their resume is really, really heavily differentiated, when in reality it looks like the same other 75 that we received in the application process. Like, how do we teach self-awareness? That's like a crucial part of what we're obviously trying to do in this world of like making coaches better communicators.
Yeah, well, I think you touch on a point within that, and that one of the key slides we had, like if I shared my screen right now, I'd take you to one of the slides in the apprenticeship that says, "Where are you the problem?" or "Where might you be the problem?" Because you're spot on. And we had a wonderful. She was a former Miss Olympia, I think, like multiple time. She came to our workshop and she was like, "I have all these clients that are, I'm in Miami," and she was amazing. But then day 2, she goes, "Oh my God, I'm the problem." Like, because day 1's very theory based. We kind of talked about a lot of these biases and all that. She goes, and I remember meeting a client of my father's once. My father was an investment banker and a financial advisor, and this client goes, my first divorce, my wife, awful. My second one, not enough drive. Third one, and pardon my language, I'm the asshole. I'm like, well, yeah. And so I think there's a recognition that, where are you the problem? And that kind of, not to be redundant, but that's again why we leaned on the role playing and improv and video evaluation is again, all these athletes, regardless of sport, will see some kind of video breakdown. They can get some kind of knowledge of results, knowledge of performance in different ways, but do coaches, right? Like, no, coaches don't. And again, like we had to create a facilitated environment that was welcoming, and we had to reduce the anxiety of people feeling like, well, I'm not going to go to some 36-year-old who hasn't been in my setting to tell me this and tell me that. It's like, hey man, I'm not going to tell you anything other than, what the research and my experience and all the, but what I'm telling you is there's a room of 30 other professionals here that, these are people that are going to, interpret these things. They're like a mock jury, right? They may not be your direct audience, but they're gonna have similar traits. And so that happened in one of our first ones in Alabama, a gentleman that worked in the NBA for like 20 some odd years, right? Had just role played out a scene. And there was a 19-year-old personal trainer that wanted to get into baseball. And he was like, well, I scored you this, I scored you that. And right then the guy goes, well, no disrespect, but this is, I've had 15 years in this and I don't see it the same way you do. And all of a sudden this woman that was in the HR side of a Fortune 500 company stood up and goes, but time out. What's the average age of the people you coach? Well, 18 to 25, blah, blah. And they go, do they know as much about training and everything as you do? No. And they go, so then why would you denigrate this person's opinion of, how you came across in that? And it started a really good dialogue. And the guy was like, yeah, I get your point. He had forgotten who his audience was. Mm-hmm. He had gotten so tied up on like this person not seeming like him that he didn't realize that they're a subsection of your wider demographic. Mm-hmm. And so that's the concept of theory of mind and curse of knowledge. Mm-hmm. So if you don't role play, if you don't put yourself and your practices under respectful contestation, not I know better than you and I'm better than you. Hey, have you thought about this? Have you looked at that? Have you considered this? Just having conversations about conversations. You can never do it because, and the biggest thing that I get annoyed with is, and again, I hate to say it because my background's performance and it sounds like I'm crapping on it, but when we get brought in by other organizations, tech or medical, we don't get the same kind of pushback that we got early days in performance. Now that's dissipated a lot, but there'd be people that are like, well, we do staff education. Great. Your staff's biased. And we're all biased, but your staff's really biased because of the power dynamics there. And I don't care how open you have, if you have a hollyocracy, that's never really how that's going to go if that's your staff. Or if you just bring people in all the time, you hear that excuse all the time. And I know this isn't something that you allow to creep into your life. One time somebody was like, well, I'd love to come, but I travel a lot. And then you start getting this, you're like, dude, I travel like 100,000 miles a year. Like I can still figure out time to like get better. And so you've got to open the door. It's got to become a norm for coaches to get better at it, right? They're so used to X's and O's, technical, tactical. And most people don't seek this kind of training in the performance space until it's too late. When we assess people that came, we said, what made you really come and do this? And they said, you know what? They either got into higher level leadership positions where they realized that's what they needed to do. That's what was going to separate them. Conceptual skills, divergent thinking, relationship building, or they're like, I screwed up in my last job. Right. And that's what you don't want. It's like an injury, right? An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Like just be proactive in how you. So I think self-awareness, subjective, objective evaluations, getting in different environments, opening things to critiques. Now, if you're not going to do any of these things, at least with consent, videotape yourself, get some kind of informed practice of how to evaluate that, side check that against other pieces. Yeah, so I don't want to be too verbose, but those are some samplings.
I think it's all outstanding. I think we talked obviously a lot like coaching the coaches, right? Let's talk about, the actual athletes when you're talking, direct consumer, right? What does the initial meeting with an athlete look like? Because you hear stories about like Stu McGill when he sees patients at his home in Canada, like he makes sure like their first consultation, like he makes them warm tea and they sit by the fire at his, basement, which is his home office, so that he can like literally let them tell the story of their back pain. So he can elicit all the information, which is a stark contrast from, 15-minute doctor's visit where they can never get to the bottom of everything. Obviously you're going over injury history, you're going over goals, movement competencies, things like that. But what are the questions that you're asking in your first interaction with an athlete to try to drive that buy-in, that curiosity, from the get-go?
Yeah. So this has changed over the years. And the general process is one that we look at as kind of empathy mapping, right? Getting an idea of what moves this individual, what drives them. And I didn't know that about Dr. McGill, but excuse me, that makes a lot of sense, especially because environment dictates behavior to a huge way. So to get them comfortable and kind of take the formality out of that is generally going to lead to higher quality or more truthful information. Yeah. And so, before, like there were certain questions that I would ask early on, and then I made it a 5-question like Google Doc as well that I could send them on their phones. But, and one of the things that I would ask them is, who's your favorite coach and why? I try to keep it very indirect. I try to keep it very indirect, very conversational, not too different than like what lawyers will do with voir dire to test for inconspicuous bias, right? Like I'll ask them questions that are fairly open-ended. And then after that, it's a little bit of pattern mapping. What are the choices so like, for example, one athlete would tell me, I liked Coach Johnson because very detail oriented, would teach every step of the way. Another athlete would tell me, I like Coach Blank because they would just get on you and, they weren't too technical. So I didn't overthink. And so people would leave you little breadcrumbs, right? And sometimes you got it right out the bat. Sometimes, you'd have to pepper these things in for weeks, much like, you do with training. You're always altering it. I remember there was a mixed martial artist that I worked with one time that couldn't get this guy to open up at all. Imagine the imposter phenomenon I felt there where I'm like the buy-in guy and I can't get this person to open up. And all of a sudden an Eric Clapton song came on the radio. And I'm like, turn this, like what, not that I don't like Eric Clapton, but I think it was like Tears in Heaven, which you don't need to hear when you're training. Yeah. And he was like, time out. And I go, what? And he's like, I love this guitar solo. And I was like, you play guitar? And he was like, yeah, absolutely. And it kind of led into why he likes MMA because the technical nuances and just he got into this huge thing of music. And I'm like 6 weeks and it took me that long. Yeah. So I used to have this laundry list of questions and it would even be retroactively after a session. I'd say, what part of the session did you like the best? Mm-hmm. Because the session was divided into competitive drills, right? Like after they'd get skill acquisition, but then they'd have some competition elements. And so there'd be 4 answers, right? Maybe one of those answers and they'd always be disguised. It could be something they did on the wall or something that they did mechanically or something with, posture. And then there were other options where it was like the 1-to-1 sprint, whatever. And so what we would start to do is link them into 4 buckets. And this was really taken from 2 Harvard business professors that were experts in evolutionary psychology. And these buckets were like learn, acquire, bond, and defend. And without going too much into it, right? Learn. We're all driven to learn. We like learning about our place in the world, right? So these are people that are more, they want that. They want those descriptions and the why, and they're very analytical. Acquire, right? People like status and they like things. So we found that a lot of the top dogs, whether there's a higher power number on a Kaiser push pull or whatever else, they wanted that opportunity to acquire and maintain that status. Bond, certain people like team relays or team kind of competitions more than others. And defend, man, they paired really well with acquires in the rack because when you were doing stuff on the Kaiser or anything like that, we'd be like, oh man, he's coming for you. And then we like what you could do is you could extrapolate it even further. And so we created our own version of this. And it's a quiz that everybody can take for free on our website. But we looked at deeper into the research that I'll go into if you'd like. But there's really 6 of these drives and we kind of renamed them. So people are driven by significance, right? They want to achieve something just really great, right? They want to be one of the best. And for athletes, that might just be in the Hall of Fame or whatever. Unity, which is very similar to the bond one I mentioned. Service. These are people that really, recognition's not that important. It's just more about like helping others. A lot of coaches are service drives. Security, these are people that are very prepared. Achievement, adversity. So anyway, we'd sprinkle out, these questions over time, and we'd start to get a little bit of a personality profile. No absolutes, just start to see where people shift over time, much like their training numbers will, right? And seasonally as well. And then what you can do is you can really tailor, much like marketers do, right? Marketers are able to look at this and they're like, what do we need to know for this demographic? What do we need to know for that demographic? So if I had some people that were very much acquire or achievement, and a lot of athletes, they just were driven by money, and they didn't want to pay attention to a deceleration drill or something that could help them, reduce the risk of injury. I just be like, listen, man, like, you're always talking about money and your next contract, and it's a contract year. Do you want to do something that can help you actually prevent, or give you a better chance of preventing this injury? Or do you want to keep whining because it's boring? And you give them that little jab and like, all right, man, whatever. Yeah. So I think just like, I don't want to overwhelm people, and not that it's beyond their comprehension. It's just tough without a visual, right? Get this kind of wide, like if you could print off a sheet, which we did, we would give interns a sheet, and it could have everything from where they were born, what their date of birth is, hobbies outside of sport. You just want to kind of get to know them over time. And I remember one coach goes, I got 150 athletes. I don't have time for that. Really? You ask them about soreness. You ask them about how they sleep. You're walking the floor. I've coached large groups of athletes, haven't you, Eric?
Yeah.
You have to chit chat a little bit in between sets. And so it's just this collective data stream. And then you can go back and you can plot that in myriad ways. So there's basic things that you can do if somebody's just starting off, getting an idea of what their drives are, asking them indirect questions. It's not the questions people struggle with. It's that most coaches don't listen to it. They don't listen to it, and then they don't do anything with that information.
And scale is it's more important than ever, but it's also easier than ever with electronic resources, more staffing, right? There's more attention to understand like that this is an industry that matters, that can make a big difference for you. We're not just seeing this, this era of one coach with 11 college teams that they have to oversee. That's just not happening nearly as often as it used to anymore. There's always staff members that can assist you with it. It's like, if you're fighting it, it's really just that you're stubbornly resisting scale.
Right. And it's such a coach thing too, because we got that question a lot, to just want a playbook on like, well, just like people have to know the exact set and rep for hypertrophy, right? It can't be any other way. Philippines chart says this, and everything says, like, I could write a book today. You and I could write some together, and it could have, all right, here's how you communicate with everybody all the time, always. That, even if that existed, which it never will, that still depends on your ability to do it. And that's why we put the workshops out. I'm like, guys, we could give you every printout in the world. Here you go. But can you actually, as a human being, be a good orator and deliver that? If you have all these questions and you're just like, have you ever been on a bad podcast, Eric, where somebody goes, so Eric, you have spent a lot of time in baseball. And then you give a question that you think is like thoughtful. And then they go, cool. So Eric, and you're like, no, man, it's about how.
They're reading the list.
Yeah. Anyway, so.
So looking back, like where, if you look at your own situation, what were the mistakes you made as a young coach when it came to, connecting with athletes, either, in the acute, like getting to know them stage, or, hey, I've been with this guy for 4 years and I'm not pushing him necessarily the way that I should. How could you have handled certain situations or people differently as you look back on it?
I think one of the most embarrassing ones is when I first left the college setting and then got in with AP, I was following a coach named Andy Barnett, who at the time, I think he left for Aussie Rules, AFL, or I think he might have gone to NRL. I don't remember, but he moved to New Zealand. But the guy was a legend, right? And in your prototypical, how a strength coach looked like, he's like 5'6", the shin high socks. He had worked at University of Wyoming, at the New York Giants under Tom Coughlin, the Olympic Training Center in Placid. Just a salty guy in his mid-50s, like sharp, right? And man, he commanded the room. And I remember he was leaving, so I was kind of taking over the NFL guys for him. This was when I was down in Pensacola. And man, at first I just tried too hard. I was very, as much as I am into psychology and human interaction and all these things, this was a point in my life where it was just periodization. I was just a junkie. If Medvedev had written this, I had read all of it. Or, I wanted to get my hands on all the translated Russian texts. And so, here I am like a jackass, knowing that I didn't have a beard at the time. I'm still relatively early into this side of it. This was my first foray really coaching pro athletes, like being in charge of it. And I'm trying to talk to them about their plan, and I'm trying to instill confidence in them, but really in me, by being like, hey, this is what the next 3 weeks looks like. I know you had Andy for a long time. Promise you're in good hands. This is where we are. This is where we're going to end up. I was so focused on almost making them feel like, hey, you're secure with me, and instead it made it kind of, even if my delivery was good, which I like to think it was, because I genuinely like people. I just think it probably came across as too clinical or focused on the training and not so much on the person. I was making sure everything meticulously was recorded like you want to, but at the extent of sometimes just being better conversationally over the flow of the session. And a lot of that is just getting comfortable in new surroundings with a new demographic and all those pieces. And then some of that also came with, at that point at API, I would coach that group at 10. I would have to coach surgeons at 7 in the morning. Then I'd have a military group where guys, these were special forces guys that had been blown up overseas. And that was a very different way to interact at like 1 p.m. And then you'd have youth in middle school. And that was a very baseball heavy place as well. So just kind of code switching a lot. I don't think I did as well. Yeah. Even though in college, I would go from men's and women's golf to football or whatever. They were still all college, And so I think that was something, as much as private sector got crapped on early on in S&C, I'm like, time out. Where else do you get to work with military and youth and baseball and surgeons and all these? And you have to do this very adeptly as well. You better be able to, and I know you do, you can go from agent to team surgeon to athlete to any kind of stakeholder seamlessly.
Yeah. Well, I think in the pro sports realm, the college sports realm, those athletes have to be there with you. In the private sector, there's a velvet rope around your business where they're paying to be with you, so there will be better buy-in. But those clients hire and fire you every single day, and when they decide to come or not come. In a major league organization, you don't show up, hey, you get fined. There's the different element to it. So I think you're right. We crap on the private sector guys, and you haven't been on the grind, and taking the long bus rides and all this stuff. But there is an element of like, hey, if you suck at what you do, you're not getting a paycheck this month.
No question. And I remember, I'm glad you said that, because for any coach listening, I remember somebody who was, they were a Twitter critic of mine. They go, do you think, this was probably back in 2015. They're like, the only reason you've coached all these athletes is because you're at that facility or whatever. And I go, no, that would actually work the opposite way, because this guy had worked in the NFL. And I go, your athletes have to come to you. Mine don't have to come here. There's myriad places they can go on the pro sports side. My job is dependent, and like, they're paying me, like you said, now they didn't pay me, they paid the company, but the company pays me. The power dynamics are completely different. If they don't like me, they can go anywhere. And by and large, my wife and I have lived 15 places, 4 of which were in when I was in S&C, and you still train these athletes, And so I think that was another thing that drove me to pro sport too, is as much as I like the college environment, there was an inherent, there was a higher difficulty, in my opinion, trading people that collectively could be, or training people that could be collectively worth 250 to 500 million, depending on how many are on the floor. And man, that's a very real responsibility. And you don't get a run. And I'm not saying every college coach or anybody's like this, but you don't get a run to the coach and be like, yo, Jacoby Ellsbury's not doing what I told him to do. Like, you better just figure out how to get, or like Xander Bogaerts or any of those guys to listen up. And if they want to listen up, they better care a little bit, And so I would say this, the last thing I'll say with that is there, something that's made it harder is, I think sometimes people confuse communication and the things we're talking about with like motivational, lovey-dovey, make them feel like they don't care what you know until they know how much you care. That's not what this has to be. No. Nobody's saying like, Dr. Phil this. Yeah. We're just saying that like, you have to treat this with some kind of overarching protocol. And if you don't think it can be done, again, remember, this has been done in the marketing world. For Coca-Cola doesn't spend $30 million on a Super Bowl ad just winging it. Yeah. They know their data. They know everything they're showing from the imagery, and I have myriad stories about like all these influence tactics that we do, because you can literally chart them, Eric. Like when I say periodization for people, there are hard influence tactics that are very much like higher intensity training load in the weight room. And then there are influence tactics that you can use in greater volumes, and so knowing which tactics work best with which people based on their drives, man, that's an iterative thing, especially if you're coaching in the US versus China and all that. So,
well, I mean, you even alluded to it, like, let's talk hard conversations. And you actually had a great, I think it was a newsletter not too long ago, just about like, how do I do? I'm a big fan. How do you approach them, right? What are the general guidelines, when you walk into these, I don't even want to call them tough love, because sometimes they aren't tough love. Sometimes they're really direct, honest feedback about something that's not going well, that is a sign of a more concerning trend. Like, do you have certain things that when you go into these difficult discussions you think are high priorities?
Yeah, a lot. And we ended up kind of conceptualizing it into what we call the LISTEN framework. Everybody loves an acronym. So, L is learn, learn, identify, strategize, trial, evaluate, next steps. So, in brief, first thing when you're going into a hard conversation is, right, you have to really lock in, like, what do you think is the core of the problem? You got to get to the root cause, and you're not always going to know these things, right? But let's say I have this hard conversation coming tomorrow. I want to, all right, what's the core issue? What might be the goals of the other party? Who's involved? And get very detailed about that. Like, this is the first time in human history 5 generations of people are in the same workplace, right? So, like, knowing if I'm appealing to a traditionalist, a baby boomer, a millennial, like these things do absolutely matter. We had a woman that worked at Notre Dame come in. She had to make an appeal for more funding, and she's like, my board, the people I answer to, one is a millennial and wants data and this and that, another's a traditionalist that just wants so they got to cater that. So once we kind of map that out, we say, okay, and this is a little nerdy, like, what are the components of communication that should be considered? When you look at 8 different components within communication, you can look at, all right, there's a lot of ways for it could go wrong. Let's look at, like, the medium, right? Is this something that's going to happen over text, over email? Those are both context poor mediums of communication. You can't ask her, is it going to happen face to face? Is it going to happen via Zoom? So what's the medium? What's the core message? What do I want to get across? Because most people, they think they're saying one thing and it comes out another way. So you've really got to clarify what's the core of your message, and also, like, what is your approach in terms of you as a communicator? Are you more, we say, like, there's certain communicators that are more realist. They're going to be matter of fact. Some that are more relators, some that are pure empathetic, some that are more analytical. So then once you have this kind of a hypothesis, that's really when you want to strategize and role play it out. So I might be like, hey, Eric, I'm reaching out to somebody tomorrow for an increase in budget. This guy's usually, like the epitome of consternation, always wants to shut everything down. This is what we've done in the past. And he's very brief. He'll cut you off. Would you help me kind of game this out? I want to try to practice my pitch with him and whatever. And then we'll trial it. And you'll be like, okay, think about this, think about that, think about that. Then we just reflect in next steps. Now, if that doesn't help and you're like, cool, Brett, what if you don't have the time to do that? How do you prepare for a hard conversation? Well, guess what? If you don't have time to prepare for it, you just got to get into it. But you can practice for it. And again, goes back to role playing, this ability to rehearse and refine for big money. Let's say you had a coach right now that reached out and they're like, hey, I've been in baseball this long and this is what I'm thinking of. And you and I interacted something with him and we're like, how was it? He's like, well, that's not really how my boss would, and we're like, okay, but it's still got value because you might encounter somebody like that. Now, that said, tell us how we could make it different and we can do it again. So you only learn one of 2 ways. Hindsight, right? I already got my butt kicked in that conversation. Now let me go back and train it. Gee whiz. Hope you have some kind of framework to help you understand where the breakdown occurred. If I get injured, I can go back and look at what contributed maybe to that hamstring. We can start piecing the puzzles. Most people don't do that with communication. Or, you have to prepare for it and you have to get better at it. And that comes from being more self-aware, knowing where you suck. We all suck at everything or at some things. It's okay. And going from there. So either way, it requires practice, reflection, refinement.
I like it. All right, so we got to talk about what's in the works. You're on your way to becoming Dr. Bartholomew, and I'm excited to hear, not just that you're doing that, but also, kind of some of the compelling research you're working way through. Talk to me about what the area of focus is, and where you hope it'll take you.
Yeah, well, you've owned a business for a long time and you've scaled it extraordinarily well, and so I think a lot of this tale spearheaded off of like the vision and mission statement, which you, as you know, have to have with a business, like if you want it to be successful. And so, like, our vision at Art of Coaching is to change the way the world interacts when it matters most. Now, my colleague Allie will be like, "Well, is it always when it matters most?" I'm like, okay, change the way the world interacts, Allie. And a lot of that is through experiential learning activities. So the doctorate is really focused on the feasibility of communication-based training with coaching, and specifically how that looks at how coaches handle power dynamics and changing contexts. Because I don't know about you, but sometimes I didn't have the playbook that I needed when I could have used it most when dealing with really Machiavellian, crappy people. And so we want to look at that and help people navigate that. So power dynamics is a preeminent part of that, communication in all of its facets. So off of that, we do work with organizations in performance, the sport world, military, tech, more and more in financial, people that realize kind of what they say matters and has real ramifications. I mean, Elon Musk can tweet something one day and all of a sudden the stock of something can plummet. Ronaldo can take the Coca-Cola thing off the the podium when he's giving a post-game speech, put water there. Coca-Cola lost $14 billion right away. You have companies like Peloton that have literally retainers for lawyers to check their comms retroactively. And, so we work with organizations and say, all right, these are some ways, like whether I'll think of most recent one, they were like, we want you to come to some staff meetings and just be an observer, right? Come to some staff meetings, look at this announcement that we're going to kind of give our staff, and then look at kind of what we're doing from an onboarding standpoint. What do you think is missing? What could be better? And it's our job not to be like, well, we know everything and you guys suck. It's our job to actually fit this within a framework and be like, we're an unbiased outsider, and here's some things that we looked at, and here's how you could accomplish them. So everything from as immersive as that to just 2-day workshops where, like I said, we've opened them up to everybody because I thought it was ridiculous that a lot of times sport coaches or strength coaches silo themselves in workshops. Yet when we go to psychology seminars, there's people from so we're like, these are open. We had somebody from Chick-fil-A. We've had strength and conditioning professionals, ATCs, occupational therapists, whatever. And so our 3 main things are in-house kind of work that we do, live events, and then digital education. And then also something that we started doing remotely since COVID, just communication training. So these are people that deal with everything from, I have a stodgy boss at work, or maybe I want to start my own brand and I need help with marketing. Anything that is about getting their message across more clearly, getting more work done, and having less drama with other people, we will do remotely with other coaches. And all of that, of course, is protected by NDAs. People don't have to worry about your stuff doesn't get spread. But yeah, just trying to help people become more power literate through this. And then a second book that, if I don't die of a heart attack within the next 6 months, hopefully we'll be out sometimes next year.
That is no easy feat, man. I've written books before and it is a grind. So I respect the hustle.
You are the measuring stick. I want you to know this, and I hate you for it. And I'm saying this smiling because, like, in the multiverse, there's a Brett that he's not on your level, but he's closer to your level. Like, you're just somebody, like, I always think about how much of a failure I am because I'm like, no. Eric, I remember when you were on our podcast, you were talking about when you had the girls and you guys were very good about alternating. You work out here, I'll work out here. We have this routine. Wait, man, I am not as structured as you. I am not as productive. Like, you are a different kind of animal. So for whatever it's worth, my problems, I feel like you would have handled in 3 months.
I appreciate it, man, but you're doing a heck of a job. And honestly, the products, I'll vouch for them. They're top notch, and I know they've helped a ton of coaches, including a lot of guys on our staff too. I think that's, there's proof in the pudding on a daily basis. When I go to the facility, I see how conscious coaching and the rest of your teachings have been outstanding for them. So maybe give folks an idea of where the best place to find you. I know your social media is outstanding, whether it's Twitter or Instagram. Where can folks check you out?
Yeah, best place is just artofcoaching.com, because that will direct link you to our newsletter, our social media, our podcast, all of that. The book is available worldwide on Amazon. And then if there's other coaches that you feel like you want to teach this someday, you want to get involved in it, we do have a facilitator program. There is a prerequisite. You do have to come to our apprenticeship course. Obviously, ethically, we can't have people teaching things that they haven't been through themselves. Believe that or not, we get that question. But we have an interest in scaling this because this company needs to be more than me. And we want it to be more than me and Allie. And so if you're somebody that's interested in human nature, behavior change, communication, and you want to make a broader impact, definitely go to artofcoaching.com, because coaching is leadership. And that's the synonymous term there.
You're the man. This was awesome. Thanks so much for taking the time. Best of luck with the book, and best of luck with your vacation. It sounds glorious. All right. Appreciate you, man.
All right.